Welcome to the Great Detectives of Old Time Radio. From Boise, Idaho, this is your host, Adam Graham. If you have a comment, email it to me, box13@greatdetectives.net. Follow us on Twitter at Radio Detectives and check us out on Instagram. Instagram.com/Great Detectives. If you're enjoying the podcast, please follow us using your favorite podcast software. Our listener support campaign continues. You can become one of our Patreon supporters over at patreon.greatdetectives.net. Well, now it's time for this week's episode of Mr. Chameleon. The original air date, November 2nd, 1949. And the title is The Murder Clue of the Carved Gold Ring.
Next, Mr. Chameleon and the Wedding Ring Murder Case. Tonight we again present the famous Mr. Chameleon of Central Police Headquarters in his famous cases of crime and murder, brought to you by the makers of genuine Bayer aspirin. Mr. Chameleon, as you know, is the famous and dreaded detective who frequently uses a disguise to track down a killer, a disguise which at all times is recognized by the audience. Tonight we give you Mr. Chameleon in The Wedding Ring Murder Case. Our story opens during the quiet hours of early afternoon, not a time which is ordinarily associated with violence. But in the luxurious apartment of Claude Langley, a young, attractive woman stands dazed and horrified, staring down at the grisly object on the living room floor and saying,
Claude! Claude! Oh, no. Oh, he's dead. Oh, I must get out of here. I must get out quickly. Oh, but no. I can't. Not until I find the ring. It must be here somewhere. It has to be here. I can't leave until I find that ring.
Mary! Mary Ward, what are you doing here?
Aura, when did you come in?
I found the front door unlatched. What are you doing in my apartment? Claude! Claude, darling! Help! Help!
Aura, please,
My
please.
husband's been murdered! And you did it, Mary. You stabbed him. You killed my husband.
Oh, no, Aura, no.
Did someone scream for help? I was in my living room and I thought I heard someone scream.
Mr. Lott, my husband's been murdered. This woman here murdered him.
Good heavens. I'll call the police, Mrs. Langley. And you, whoever you are, don't try to get away.
And a short time later, Mr. Chameleon, the astute and dreaded detective, is in the Langley apartment with Detective Dave Arnold. And he is saying to the three white-faced people who sit facing him,
One at a time, please. Don't all talk at once. Mrs. Langley, you first. Tell me what happened. Now, you say that you returned here to your apartment and found your husband murdered. Now, where had you been?
I was out shopping, Mr. Chameleon.
Where, Mrs. Langley?
At the Regent dress shop. I bought that dinner dress in the box over there. When I came home, I found my front door unlatched. I walked in to find Claude, my husband, dead. And Mary Ward going through his desk.
But I didn't kill him.
You'll have your chance to tell your story in just a moment, Mary Ward. Dave, have you removed the knife from the body?
Yes, Mr. Chameleon. We'll go over it for fingerprints.
Right. Mrs. Langley, what makes you so sure that it was Mary Ward who killed your husband? Aside from the fact that you found her here in your apartment. Oh, incidentally, are you good friends?
Mary's no friend of mine, Mr. Chameleon. And she murdered Claude, my husband, because she was madly in love with him, and he'd have none of it. He warned her to keep away from him.
That's not true, Aura.
Mr. Chameleon, Mary met my husband through her own husband, Don. And she proceeded to fall in love with him. She made his life miserable.
Mrs. Langley, It's my duty to ask unpleasant questions, and I must ask you this one. Didn't your husband encourage Mary Ward at all?
Mr. Chameleon, it's quite true. He had a mild flirtation with Mary. But Claude loved me. When it ceased to be a mild flirtation, he told Mary it had to stop.
And she came here and killed him?
No, Mr. Chameleon, I didn't kill Claude. He was dead when I got here. I found the door unlatched, too. And when I walked in, there he was with the knife at his chest.
But there was no one else in the apartment?
Why, no, I don't suppose there was.
Mrs. Langley, will you swear that the situation between your husband and Mary Ward here was exactly the way you described it?
Of course I will. All our friends will back me up, Mr. Chameleon. Everyone was gossiping about Mary. She was crazy about poor Claude.
Thank you. Mr. Lott, suppose you give me your version of what happened.
It's very simple, Mr. Chameleon. I have the apartment next door to the Langleys. I heard Mrs. Langley scream, and I rushed in, and here they were, Mary Ward and Mrs. Langley, and Mr. Langley's body on the floor.
Well, did you hear any noise in this apartment, Mr. Lott, before Mrs. Langley screamed?
Why, no, Mr. Chameleon.
You hesitated. Why?
Well, I heard no noise, but about half an hour earlier, I saw Mary Ward entering the apartment.
You didn't, Mr. Lott. You never saw me come in, not half an hour before you heard Ora scream.
Oh, yes, I did, Mrs. Ward. I opened my door to get the afternoon paper, which is always left in the hall around 2, and I saw you going through the door of the Langley apartment. I presume Mr. Langley let you in.
And I say that's a lie. It's a wicked lie.
Try to calm yourself, Mary Ward. Now, there's no use denying that you were here in the Langley apartment. What were you doing here? Why did you come? Well, answer me, please.
Well, I came to get my ring, Mr. Chameleon. Claude had phoned me. He said his wife, Ora, was out shopping and he'd be here alone, so I came to get my ring.
What ring?
My wedding ring.
Mrs. Ward, you mean Claude Langley had your wedding ring?
That's absurd, Mr. Chameleon. What would my husband be doing with Mary's wedding ring?
Please, Mrs. Langley. It's Mary Ward's turn now. Tell me about it, Mrs. Ward. Please give me the whole story.
Well, I did meet Claude through my husband, Don. I met him at a dinner party. He was there without his wife, Ora.
Mr. Chameleon.
Please, Mrs. Langley. I want to hear Mrs. Ward out to the end. Go on, Mrs. Ward. Did you meet Claude Langley again later?
Yes, Mr. Chameleon. My husband, Don, was out of town on business, and Claude asked me to have luncheon, later cocktails. It was a mild flirtation, but that was all, and I was sorry for him.
Why?
He finally told me about Ora. He said... But I'd rather not repeat it.
I'm sorry you must, Mrs. Ward. This is murder, and we cannot consider anyone's feelings. What did Claude Langley tell you?
That he was very unhappy. That Ora had married him for his money. That all she cared about was getting her hands on that money.
Oh, now, really?
Go on, Mrs. Ward. What about your wedding ring?
Well, my wedding ring, Mr. Chameleon, is very unusual. It's a carved gold ring. I value it highly.
Yet you gave it to Claude Langley.
No. You see, I haven't been well. I lost a lot of weight, and the wedding ring was loose on my finger. Oh, one day at luncheon it slipped off, and Claude offered to get it fixed, have it made smaller. It was a very unusual leaf design.
You mean it wouldn't be as easy to make smaller as a plain wedding ring?
Yes, that's right, Mr. Chameleon. Claude said he knew a clever jeweler who could make it smaller.
And then?
Then I gave it to him.
Extraordinary thing for a married woman to give another man her wedding ring.
Well, anyway, I gave it to Claude to have it made smaller, and Claude refused to give it back, Mr. Chameleon. He held it over my head as a constant threat. He tried to make me leave Don, my husband, and go with him. And he said if I didn't go with him, he'd tell Don I'd given him the ring as a token of my affection.
Did you tell your husband about this?
No, I was afraid to, Mr. Chameleon. I love Don, but he's insanely jealous. I was afraid of what he'd do.
I see. What is your husband's business phone number, Mrs. Ward?
Why, Butterfield 89970.
Dave.
Yes, Mr.
You
Chameleon.
call that number, please. I want to speak to Don Ward.
Okay, sir.
But, Mr. Chameleon, what for? Why do you want to speak to my husband?
I want to check on his whereabouts at the time of Claude Langley's murder.
Oh, but, Mr. Chameleon, my husband Don is a salesman for a brokerage firm. I'm sure he'll be out calling on customers. I'm sure of it.
How can you be so sure that he won't be in, Mrs. Ward, unless you know that he isn't in?
Well, of course, I don't know.
And another thing, you say that you've lost weight. Just how much weight did you lose, Mrs. Ward?
About 10 pounds.
Hardly enough to make a ring slip off your finger. Also, you say you lost weight because of illness. Well, is it not possible that you are trying to lose weight, Mrs. Ward, in order to be more attractive to Claude Langley?
Why,
that is one of the first things a woman does, you know, when she wants to attract a man, to slim down a bit.
No, Mr. Chameleon, I cared nothing for Claude.
Mr. Chameleon?
Yes, Dave, did you get Don Ward on the phone?
No, sir. His secretary says he hasn't been in since noon. She thought he went out to meet his wife for luncheon.
But you did not meet him for luncheon, did you, Mrs. Ward?
No, Mr. Chameleon, I tell you, Don was out seeing customers.
Or he might have been here in the Langley apartment between 12 and 2.
Mr. Chameleon, I just thought of something.
Yes, Mr. Lott?
About half an hour before I saw Mrs. Ward in the hall, I was coming in and I saw a man ringing Claude Langley's bell. A very tall man with reddish hair.
With reddish hair, huh? Mrs. Ward, does that describe your husband?
Yes, it does, Mr. Chameleon, but I swear neither Don nor I murdered Claude Langley.
Well, someone did, Mrs. Ward, and I intend to find that someone. Dave, search this apartment thoroughly for Mrs. Ward's carved gold wedding ring.
Yes, sir.
Mrs. Langley, I want you and Marvin Lott to go to Central Police Headquarters to sign a deposition telling how you found the body, with Mrs. Ward in the room.
And what about me?
You, Mrs. Ward? Well, for the present, I haven't quite enough evidence to hold you for murder, but I may get in touch with you later in the day, after I've had a little talk with your husband.
And a little later, we find Mr. Chameleon in Don Ward's office, and he is saying to Don Ward, who has just risen to his feet,
How do you do, Mr. Ward? I'm Chameleon of Central Police Headquarters. I've come to talk to you about the murder of Claude Langley.
Claude Langley? Claude murdered?
You don't seem too surprised. Your voice is surprised, but your eyes are not.
Now, look here, Mr. Chameleon.
He was stabbed to death between 12 and 2 this afternoon. Where were you at that time?
I was out.
I know that, but just where, Mr. Ward?
Well, I was just walking around. Have you talked to my wife, Mary?
I have. She was in the room with Claude Langley's body. Mrs. Langley found her there.
Mr. Chameleon, if you mean my wife, Mary, murdered Claude, I don't believe it. I love Mary. She's not capable of killing anyone.
Well, then, if you love her, Mr. Ward, tell me the whole truth. Where were you at the time of Claude Langley's death?
I can't tell you. I can't tell you.
Is that your final word?
Yes, Mr. Chameleon. That's my final word.
Very well, Mr. Ward. If you refuse to cooperate, there's nothing more that I can do at the moment. I shall be seeing you and your wife again later. I'll want to question you both further. Goodbye, Mr. Ward.
Hello?
Hello, Don. Is Mr. Chameleon, the detective, there?
No, Mary, he just left. Now, Mary, listen. Did you tell him I knew about your wedding ring? Did you tell him you told me only this morning that Claude had the ring?
No, Don, I didn't. Something stopped me. Oh, darling, I'm so afraid.
So am I. But when he questioned me, I refused to say much. I wanted to talk to you first. Mary, can we say that we had luncheon together?
No, Don, that won't work. Mr. Chameleon knows that we didn't. And besides, I was seen at lunch at Marto's today by a dozen people who know us.
Then let's say we met right after lunch, at some place as far as possible from the Langley apartment. We've got to have an alibi, Mary, both of us. And if we stick to our story, there's nothing they can do about it.
And a little later, at Central Headquarters in the office of the Commissioner of Police, we find Mr. Chameleon talking to the Commissioner.
Well, I quite agree with you, Commissioner. Mary Ward's story is a very strange one indeed. So far, no trace has been found of her carved gold wedding ring, which she says she was trying to get back from the murdered man. She may have made it all up. There's no telling. Not yet.
But, Chameleon, what about our husband, Don Ward?
Oh, he was so panic-stricken he could hardly talk. If only I could find the ring. I feel it's the key to everything. Oh, it's probably for me, Commissioner. I called the manager of the Regent dress shop where Claude Langley's widow, Aura, said she bought her dress today. Chameleon speaking.
Mr. Chameleon, this is Mrs. Arthur of the Regent dress shop. I understand you called me.
Ah, yes, Mrs. Arthur. Have you a customer named Aura Langley?
Indeed we do. She has a charge account here.
Did she buy a dinner dress in your shop today?
Why, no. She bought a dinner dress here 2 days ago, but not today.
Was she in your shop at all today?
No, Mr. Chameleon, and I would have known. I always wait on her myself.
You're positive Mrs. Langley was not in your shop at all today?
Yes, Mr. Chameleon, I'm absolutely positive.
Thank you, Mrs. Arthur. Commissioner, Ora Langley was lying too.
Oh, she was.
Mm-hmm. She told me that at the time her husband was murdered, she'd been out shopping. She'd bought a dinner dress at the Regent Dress Shop. It seems she didn't go near the Regent Dress Shop today. Mrs. Langley is in my office with Marvin Lott. I think I'd better step in there right now and ask the lady why she lied.
Mr. Chameleon and the wedding ring murder case continues in just a moment. A very important thing to know about genuine Bayer aspirin is that its single active ingredient is so gentle to the system mothers give it even to small children on their doctor's advice. Always remember this, because it means that when you have an ordinary headache, neuritic, or neuralgic pain, you can take Bayer aspirin with complete confidence. For Bayer aspirin gives you more than fast relief. It also gives you the dependable relief that's important to your health. Bayer aspirin speed is proved by the fact that it's actually ready to go to work in 2 seconds. And its dependability is proved by the fact that no other pain reliever can match its record of use by millions of normal people without ill effect. So don't experiment when you're in pain. Don't risk using drugs that have not stood the test of time. Instead, use something that millions know from experience is fast and completely dependable too, genuine Bayer aspirin. And when you buy, ask for it by its full name, Bayer aspirin, not just for aspirin alone. Get the 100-tablet bottle and you get Bayer aspirin tablets for less than a penny apiece. And now back to Mr. Chameleon and the wedding ring murder case. Claude Langley's murder has resulted in conflicting stories from Mary Ward, who admitted she had a flirtation with Claude, and from his widow, Ora, and from Mary Ward's husband, Don. And now in Mr. Chameleon's office, we find him confronting Ora Langley, while Marvin Lott, her neighbor, looks on with interest. And Chameleon is saying,
Mrs. Langley, you did not tell me the truth. You said you were out shopping at the time of your husband's murder. You said you bought a dinner dress at the Regent Dress Shop.
I did, Mr. Chameleon.
The manager of the shop says that you did not. You bought that dress 2 days ago.
Well, she's crazy. I was in there at 1 o'clock sharp. I remember because I looked at the clock on the wall.
Mrs. Langley, the manager would testify against you in court. Now, it might go badly for you, so I advise you to tell me the truth.
I'm trying to, Mr. Chameleon, but you make it so difficult.
You did not go to the Regent Dress Shop.
All right, I didn't. But I intended to.
What do you mean?
I was taking the dress back because I didn't really like it. I left my apartment about 1:45.
Mr. Lott, could you verify this statement of Mrs. Langley's?
Why, no, Mr. Chameleon, I'm afraid I couldn't. I live in the apartment next door, to be sure, but I don't always hear people going in and out.
Yet you saw Don Ward ringing the Langley doorbell. Later, you saw Mary Ward going in, but you did not see Mrs. Langley leave or return.
No, Mr. Chameleon.
And what does that prove? I'm telling you the truth.
You lied about the dress, Mrs. Langley.
Whatever I did on the spur of the moment, you surely don't think I murdered my husband. You couldn't think that, Mr. Chameleon.
You inherited his money. He told Mary Ward that you married him for his money.
He did not. I loved Claude. I'm completely innocent of his death. You have no right to accuse an innocent person.
Mrs. Langley, do you see that motto over my desk? The innocent must be protected. The guilty must be punished. But sometimes the innocent make it hard for us to protect them, because they lie in a mistaken effort to protect themselves.
Well, I'm not lying.
Mrs. Langley, you shouldn't get so panic-stricken.
I'm not panic-stricken, Mr. Lott. And you keep out of this.
Sorry?
All right, Mrs. Langley. That's all I have to say for now. You may go. Oh, and you too, Mr. Lott.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chameleon. If you need me further, don't hesitate to call on me.
I will, Mr. Lott. And as for you, Mrs. Langley, I'm sorry that I upset you. But my only interest is in finding your husband's murderer.
And if you do, Mr. Chameleon, you'll find it's not I.
You almost sound as if you knew who it was, Mrs. Langley.
I should think it was pretty obvious. You never found Mary Ward's gold wedding ring, did you? So you know that she was lying when she said Claude, my husband, had it. Goodbye.
Dave?
Yes, Mr. Chameleon. Boy, Mrs. Langley certainly left in a state, didn't she?
Everyone concerned seems to get all worked up. And the lies are accumulating so fast it isn't funny.
Sometimes people lie because they're scared, Mr. Chameleon. You know from past experience how many innocent people lie.
Yes, I do, Dave. It's exactly the theory I'm proceeding on. And I'm also returning to Don Ward's office.
To search for his wife's wedding ring?
Exactly, Dave. But I'm going there disguised as a telephone repairman. Not too bright guy named Pete Little. Everything hangs on that carved gold wedding ring. I've got to find it, Dave. I've got to get my hands on it.
And so, a little later, we find Mr. Chameleon in his disguise as the telephone repairman, Pete Little. And while Detective Dave Arnold waits outside, keeping well out of sight, Chameleon knocks on Don Ward's office door and waits. Then he speaks in the voice of his disguise when the door opens.
That's Mr. Ward's office, Mr. Don Ward.
Why, yes, but Mr. Ward isn't here just now.
That don't matter. I'm the telephone repairman. His phone ain't working.
Well, did you speak to his secretary?
Ain't you his secretary?
No, I'm his wife. That's his secretary's office over there. This is Mr. Ward's private entrance.
Yeah? Well, just as long as it's a door I can walk through. I gotta fix the phone. Look, lady, I'm coming in.
Well, I guess it's all right.
Sure, it's all right. Why wouldn't it be all right? When the phone's out of order, you fix it. I better move this typewriter over to the table. Gives me more room.
Oh, hello, Mary. Did I keep you waiting? Who's this man?
Oh, he's the telephone repairman, Don.
What?
You hired her. I come to fix the telephone.
Well, there's nothing wrong with my telephone. I didn't send for any repairman.
Are you nuts?
No, I didn't send for you. I don't know who you are or what you want, but get out.
What are you so excited about?
Because I didn't send for you. I don't want you here. Now get out. Get out or I'll throw you out.
Okay. I think you're nuts.
I don't care what you think. I said I'd throw you out, and I will. Hey, come on. Listen, get out. Let go, you big bully.
My, what a temper you have, Mr. Ward. And you're strong as a bull.
Mr. Chameleon, you all right?
Yes, Dave. Except for a few black and blue marks on my arm.
Oh, just let me go in there.
No. They mustn't know that I was Chameleon. We better get out of sight. Quick, Dave. Besides, I found out what I want to know. Now all you have to do is to go down to City Hall.
City Hall?
Yes, City Hall. I have some research work for you to do, Dave, and then we'll be ready for the next step. I think I'll call a little conference of everyone involved. I'm going to telephone Marvin Lott and ask him if we can use his apartment. These women are so hysterical, I don't want to take them back to the murder scene.
They sure are riding high.
And that evening, we find Mr. Chameleon relaxing in an easy chair in Marvin Lott's apartment. But the four other people sitting there are anything but relaxed, with the exception of Marvin Lott. And we hear Ora Langley saying,
But, Mr. Chameleon, I don't quite understand. Why did you gather us together in Mr. Lott's apartment?
Well, Mr. Lott doesn't mind. Do you, Mr. Lott?
Not at all, but I'm rather curious.
So am I, Mr. Chameleon.
Yes, I am, too.
Well, I'll tell you, Mrs. Ward and Mr. Ward. And this applies to you, too, Mrs. Langley. You've all of you proven so very excitable that I thought it best to hold this little conference here, close to the murder scene, yet not actually on the spot, because of the emotional impact.
You're very considerate of us all of a sudden, Mr. Chameleon. Are you sure that's your only reason for coming here to this apartment?
I believe you know the answer to that one, Mrs. Langley.
What do you mean?
I mean I did have a second reason for bringing you here, as you know.
Mr. Chameleon, get to the point. What's this all about?
Yes, you've no right to torture us.
I'm not trying to torture you, Mrs. Ward. And the few minutes' anxiety you're all suffering now is nothing compared to Claude Langley's brutal stabbing. But, Mrs. Ward, wouldn't you say that your carved gold wedding ring was important, the ring that you insist Claude Langley was holding?
Why, yes.
Well, I've been tipped off that missing wedding ring is here in this apartment.
What?
Here in my apartment? You're joking, Mr. Chameleon.
No, Mr. Lott, I was tipped off that I'd find Mrs. Ward's carved gold wedding ring in that Dresden vase on your mantel.
Well, that's ridiculous. There's no ring there.
Suppose I look and see, Mr. Lott. Don't try to stop me. Detective Arnold is standing right behind you.
That's right, Mr. Lott. Stay where you are.
But there's no ring in that vase.
You're mistaken, Mr. Lott. Here it is in the vase, just as my informant told me.
What?
Mrs. Ward, this is your carved gold wedding ring, isn't it?
Yes, Mr. Chameleon.
Mr. Ward, you recognize your wife's wedding ring?
Yes.
Well, Mr. Lott, what do you have to say?
It's a frame-up. A dirty frame-up.
Here is the ring, Mr. Lott. How did it get here in your apartment?
I tell you it's a frame-up, Mr. Chameleon. Who told you it was there? Answer me. Who told you?
Don't you know?
Yes, I do. It was you, Aura. It was you, wasn't it, you double-crossing cheat?
Marvin!
You got yourself in a spot by lying about that dress. You were scared to death. I know. I saw you in Mr. Chameleon's office. So you planted the ring on me to save your own neck. I'll kill you for that.
No, you won't. Grab him, Dave.
I've got him, Mr. Chameleon.
You double-crossing cheat, Aura, you murderess.
Shut up! I didn't kill Claude. It was you, Marvin, you!
Or perhaps both of you together, Mr. and Mrs. Lott.
What?
Oh, yes. I know that you two are man and wife. We found a record of your marriage to Marvin Lott 10 years ago. Later, you, Aura, married Claude Langley bigamously. You must have, since there is no record of a divorce from Marvin Lott. You married Claude Langley, and you killed him for his money. You plunged the knife into his heart.
But I didn't. It was Marvin. I'll testify in court it was Marvin.
And I'll testify it was you, Aura, who planned the whole thing.
That should wrap it up very neatly. The two of you planned to murder Claude Langley for his money. And when you learned that Claude had Mary Ward's wedding ring, you saw the perfect chance to pin the murder on her or her husband.
But, Mr. Chameleon.
Yes, Mr. Ward.
Mary's wedding ring, how did it get here in Lott's apartment?
Well, I found it, of course, in your office, Mr. Ward, hidden in the typewriter. I thought that's where it was. You hovered so anxiously over that typewriter the first time I saw you. You had paid a visit to Claude Langley, too, Mr. Ward, the day of the murder, and got the ring. And then you were panicking, lost your head, and lied. No one tipped me off that the ring was here in Lott's apartment. It was I who planted it here in order to catch Claude Langley's killer.
And with these words, Mr. Chameleon concludes tonight's murder case. If you've ever had difficulty giving your children the proper dosage of aspirin as prescribed by your doctor, you'll be glad to know you can now get genuine Bayer aspirin in a new children's-sized tablet. These new tablets contain half the amount of the regular-size Bayer aspirin tablets, and with them, you can conveniently give your child the dosage your doctor wants him to have. Yes, and they're made so easy that they can be broken right in half whenever still smaller dosages are required. In addition, they're neither colored nor flavored, and hence cannot be mistaken for candy. And they may be used with complete confidence. For the fact that doctors prescribe Bayer aspirin's single active ingredient even for the smallest children shows how gentle and dependable it is. The bottle and carton are plainly marked children's size Bayer aspirin, 30 tablets for 25 cents. Listen next Wednesday night at this same time for Mr. Chameleon, the man of many faces, in The Stolen Melody Murder Case. The part of Mr. Chameleon is played by Karl Swenson, with dialogue by Marie Baumer, from the original story by Frank and Ann Hummert. Music directed by Victor Arden. Your announcer is Howard Claney.
To millions, tooth decay means suffering, worry, expense. But now, thanks to a remarkable scientific discovery, you can actually cut down tooth decay simply by using new ammoniated Dr. Lyon's tooth powder. Based on a formula developed by University of Illinois scientists, it actually destroys bacteria Lactobacillus acidophilus which cause tooth decay. As a result, dentists by the thousands recommend this type dentifrice. So to cut down tooth decay, to have sounder, healthier, handsomer teeth, use ammoniated Dr. Lyon's tooth powder. Both regular Dr. Lyon's tooth powder and new ammoniated Dr. Lyon's are at all drug and toilet goods counters.
Listen for Mr. Chameleon in The Stolen Melody murder case next Wednesday night at this time. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.
Welcome back. I suspected the upstairs neighbor from pretty much the start. He just seemed to be a little bit too helpful to the police, particularly when he was providing damning evidence, but then at other times he would be conveniently unaware, or I'm not able to say. Plus the fact that his testimony contradicted her and her husband meant that either he was the killer or they were, and I thought he made more sense with the way this series worked. Of course, the detail of him being secretly married to the supposed wife of the murdered man and her being a bigamist seems a bit unnecessary for this case. It doesn't really add to the plot. On one hand, it did make it easy for the police to associate them and explain why it was that Chameleon knew that they were connected. On the other, it seems that they committed bigamy and both lived in the same apartment under their right name, though she obviously married the murder victim with her maiden name. You'd kind of expect one of them to take on a pseudonym for their own protection, but then again, they are Mr. Chameleon villains, so what are you gonna do? Alright, well now let's go ahead and talk a bit about the plan for Thursdays in the coming season. As I talked about, Mr. and Mrs. North is going to come to Thursdays as we put a pause on Mr. Chameleon for a while. And that will actually be the final series in the line of Thursday shows that began with Sherlock Holmes back in season 1. At that point, we will have Great Detectives Monday through Friday, and my plan right now is to move Dragnet from Saturday to Thursday. I've toyed with the idea of having Dragnet on Friday so we could have Fridays with Friday, but Friday has been the Johnny Dollar spot for the past 15 years, and I don't see a reason to change that. And then on Saturday, we will have an old-time radio adventure series. I had really hoped that I'd be able to bring you Bold Venture with Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, but there has been a situation where Karl Amari formed a group to license the transcriptions of Bold Venture and purchased a set of all 78 episodes, including many that were not in circulation, and so he sent those out to the group that contributed to the GoFundMe effort to purchase those transcription discs. The way that he is phrased this particular license claim puts me in a situation where I don't feel comfortable at this point presenting Bold Venture, even if I use internet files that are in no way connected to the disc he purchased. So instead, we will probably be bringing you Counter Spy. That will be played on Saturday, and we will have it on the Great Detectives feed for a while, as long as we are playing kind of detective-adjacent adventure programs. And then hopefully that grows to enough point where it's its own thing and no longer on that feed, and it's an entirely separate feed, which of course we'll also be setting up at the same time. Some of the series that we will end up playing will include things like Voyage of the Scarlet Queen, Cloak and Dagger, Secret Agent K7 Returns, and there are more series that I'll end up considering. There are some that are not detective adjacent, which we obviously won't play here and will be past the point where it gets to its own feed, things like The Adventures of the Scarlet Pimpernel. With the Adventure podcast, I also am aiming to have 2 episodes per week. One episode would feature an adult adventure program, and the other would feature a juvenile adventure program. I think that there are some pretty high-quality juvenile adventure programs. They're not for everyone, but kind of like with Great Detectives, where I play all different types of detective programs with the old-time radio adventures, I'd like to feature all sorts of adventure programs, and listeners can just listen to the ones they like. So that is going to be coming up, again, quite a few months off. We've got a few weeks more of Mr. Chameleon and several months more of Mr. and Mrs. North, although I might launch the adventure podcast with the juvenile programs while we're still waiting to finish up Mr. and Mrs. North. All right, well, now we turn to listener comments and feedback, and have a comment from YouTube. Kim writes, "This New Yorker, still trying to get used to the narrator's accent. Bless him." Thank you, Kim. Appreciate your effort on that. And then comment from Maria. "Thanks for posting this new black and white classic detective series, which are my old favorite episodes, which I'll not miss in the world." Well, thank you so much, Maria. And that's, of course, a reference to the thumbnails that we use on YouTube, which quite often are in black and white, which I think, does serve our channel pretty well. All right, well, now it is time to thank our Patreon supporter of the day, and I want to go ahead and thank Alexandra. Alexandra's been one of our Patreon supporters since September 2016. Currently supporting the podcast at the Detective Sergeant level of $7.14 or more per month. Thank you so much for your support. And that will actually do it for today. If you're enjoying the podcast, please follow us using your favorite podcast software. And be sure to rate and review the podcast wherever you download it from. We'll be back next Thursday with another episode of Mr. Chameleon, but join us back here tomorrow for yours truly, Johnny Dollar, where...
Well, we've released the statements, the newspapers. I thought you had heard.
No, ma'am, I haven't.
You've made a trip over here for nothing, then.
Oh?
Yeah, you see, my husband erred when he identified that body as being our daughter's. It couldn't possibly have been.
Well, I know you're glad of that, Mrs. Mason. But what made Mr. Mason change his mind?
I haven't changed it, Dollar.
George, I thought you were going to stay in your room.
Never mind. Dollar, any questions you want to ask, I'll try to answer them.
Why, George Mason, you've been drinking.
Only enough to take the bad taste out of my mouth, and you know what put it there. Don't look so mixed up, Jenny. I tried going along with you, but I got too weak a stomach. So here I am.
I don't know what you're talking about.
No. Listen, Dollar. Soon as they found out that girl had been murdered, my wife here decided it couldn't have been Dollar.
It isn't Dollar, and you know it.
Only thing I know is that you got a set idea good, proper people don't die nowhere else but in bed.
I hope you'll be with us then. In the meantime, send your comments to box13@greatdetectives.net. Follow us on Twitter at Radio Detectives, and check us out on Instagram, instagram.com/Great Detectives. From Boise, Idaho, this is your host, Adam Graham, signing off.